The shadow pressed itself flatter against the bark, feeling the roughness dig into what passed for its skin, watching through eyes that weren't quite eyes as the little girl with copper braids stepped closer to the tree line. She was 8 years old, barefoot despite the October chill, and she was humming something tuneless and innocent. The creature that had once been Nathaniel Frost could taste her fear before she even knew to be afraid, could feel the way her heartbeat would accelerate in exactly 12 seconds when she noticed the wrongness in the air, the way the birds had gone silent, the way the shadows under the pines seemed to breathe. It had been feeding on fear for 143 years, had perfected the art of psychological terror until it could make grown men weep without ever showing itself fully, and this child would be so easy, so deliciously simple to break. Her name was Emma Whitmore, and she had moved into the old Branson Ranch 3 months ago with her parents and older brother, and she came to the forest edge every Tuesday afternoon at exactly 4:47 p.m., drawn by something she couldn't name, something the shadow had been carefully cultivating in her dreams. The creature had already decided where to position itself for maximum impact, had calculated the exact angle of late afternoon sunlight that would cast its form in the most disturbing way, had practiced the whisper that would sound like her dead grandmother's voice, because it had learned over more than a century that the most effective terror came from perverting love, from taking the shapes of comfort and twisting them into nightmare. But then Emma did something unexpected. She stopped humming, tilted her head in that way children do when they're listening to something adults can't hear, and she looked directly at the shadow, not with fear, but with a heartbreaking kind of recognition, and she whispered, "I know you're sad. I know you didn't mean to become this. If you connect with my story, please press the like button to find some light in this heart. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next life stories, and tell me about them in the comments where you are watching this video and what time it is right now. It makes me very happy to know that from any corner of the country or the world you are listening to me. The thing that called itself Shadow, though it had been born Nathaniel Frost in 1847, had forgotten what it meant to be seen rather than feared. For so long, it had been the presence in peripheral vision, the movement in the corner of the eye, the reason children pulled their blankets over their heads and adults checked their locks 3 times before bed. Montana's wilderness had been its hunting ground since the winter of 1881, when its transformation from man to something else had been completed in blood and anguish, and a grief so profound it had literally torn holes in the fabric of what was real. The forests outside of Whitefish had changed over the decades, had seen logging companies come and go, had watched as dirt roads became paved highways, as lantern light gave way to electricity, but the trees themselves remembered. The ponderosa pines and Douglas firs held the echo of what had happened here, and they had borne witness to every victim the shadow had claimed, every soul it had driven to madness, every life it had consumed in its endless hunger for the fear that had become its only sustenance. But Emma Whitmore, with her copper braids and her grandmother's eyes, had just spoken to the darkness inside it, had acknowledged not its power, but its pain, and for the first time in over a century, the shadow felt something besides hunger. It felt something terrifyingly close to recognition. The Frost family had come to Montana Territory in the spring of 1879, part of that great wave of settlers who believed the West held promises the East could no longer keep. Nathaniel had been 32 then, a schoolteacher from Pennsylvania with soft hands and big dreams, married to Rebecca, 28, who could play piano like an angel and believed in her husband's vision of bringing education to the frontier. They had 2 children, Samuel, age 9, who loved to sketch birds and collected feathers with scientific precision, and little Margaret, only 5 years old, who laughed like bells and had never met a stranger she didn't try to befriend. They had claimed 160 acres under the Homestead Act, built a cabin with their own hands, planted wheat and vegetables, and for 18 months they had been genuinely happy. Nathaniel taught at the one-room schoolhouse in Whitefish. Rebecca gave piano lessons to the miners' daughters. Samuel catalogued every bird species he could find in the surrounding forests, and Margaret made friends with every creature that crossed their land. It had been a good life, simple and clean, the kind of existence that made a man believe in providence and the essential goodness of the world. Then winter came early in 1881, and with it came the Harker brothers. There had been 4 of them. Cyrus, the eldest at 42, with dead eyes and hands that had killed before. James, 37, who laughed at suffering the way other men laughed at jokes. Thomas, 34, who was quiet, but perhaps the cruelest of all, because his cruelty was methodical and considered. And young William, only 23, who hadn't wanted to be there, but was too weak to stand against his brothers. They were outlaws, had robbed a bank in Helena, and killed the marshal in the process, and they needed a place to hide until the search parties moved on. The Frost cabin, isolated and peaceful, must have seemed like providence of a different kind. They came in the middle of a December night when the snow was falling so thick it muffled all sound, and they kicked in the door with guns drawn and hunger in their eyes that had nothing to do with food. What happened next took 3 days. Nathaniel tried to fight them at first, tried to protect his family, and Cyrus Harker broke his fingers one by one while making Rebecca and the children watch. Samuel tried to run on the 2nd day, tried to get to the neighboring homestead 5 miles away through the snow, and Thomas brought him back with a rope around his neck like an animal. Rebecca stopped speaking on the 3rd day, just stared at the wall and hummed hymns while her children cried. And Margaret, sweet Margaret, who had never met a stranger, she begged the men for mercy until her voice gave out completely. The shadow that had been Nathaniel Frost did not like to remember what came after, how James Harker had made a game of it, how Thomas had been systematic in his destruction, how even young William had participated when his brothers called him a coward. It did not like to remember Rebecca's final scream, or Samuel's last words, which had been, "I'm sorry, Papa," though the boy had nothing to apologize for, or the way Margaret had reached for her father, even as the light left her eyes. What the shadow remembered with perfect clarity was the moment when something inside Nathaniel Frost shattered so completely that the pieces couldn't be reassembled into anything human. The Harker brothers had left on the 4th morning, had taken the Frost's horses and supplies, and ridden off toward Canada, laughing about how easy it had been, how soft these eastern settlers were, how the world was full of people just waiting to be broken. They left Nathaniel alive, tied to a chair in the cabin that stank of death and kerosene, surrounded by the bodies of everyone he had loved. They left him alive because Cyrus Harker thought it would be funnier that way, thought the memory would torture him more than a bullet would. They had no idea how right they were. Nathaniel should have died in that cabin. He should have frozen when the fire went out, or starved when he couldn't reach food, or simply willed himself to stop breathing because what was the point of breath when everything that mattered was gone? But something happened in those hours of darkness and cold, something that started in the place where his heart used to beat and spread through his body like black ink in water. The grief was so enormous it became physical, became a weight that crushed his chest and stopped his lungs and should have killed him but somehow didn't. The rage was so pure it felt like burning, like every cell in his body was on fire with the need for vengeance, for justice, for any action that might make the pain stop for even a moment. And underneath both grief and rage was something else, something ancient and hungry that had been sleeping in the Montana wilderness since before humans gave it names, something that recognized in Nathaniel's suffering an opportunity for existence. The old tribes who had lived in these forests before the settlers came had stories about it, had called it the grief that walks, the shadow that feeds, the darkness that remembers. They had known that certain kinds of pain could tear holes between worlds, that certain kinds of rage could give formless things form, that certain kinds of loss could transform a human soul into something that no longer belonged to the realm of flesh and blood. When the neighbor, Henrik Johansson, age 45, found the cabin 6 days later, he found the bodies of Rebecca, Samuel, and Margaret Frost frozen in positions of terror and pleading. He found evidence of the Harker brothers' presence, found their tracks leading north through the snow. But he did not find Nathaniel Frost, not exactly. What he found was a shadow on the wall in the shape of a man, a darkness that seemed to pulse and breathe, and when Henrik approached it with his lantern held high, the shadow turned to look at him with eyes that held nothing human, and Henrik Johansson ran screaming from that cabin and never spoke coherently about what he'd seen again. The town of Whitefish organized a search party, found the Harker brothers 3 days later, frozen solid in a snowbank 20 miles north of the Canadian border, their faces locked in expressions of such absolute terror that the men who found them had nightmares for years afterward. But they never found Nathaniel Frost, never found any trace of the schoolteacher from Pennsylvania who had loved his family and believed in the goodness of the world. Some people said he'd lost his mind and wandered off into the wilderness to die. Others whispered that the Harkers had killed him too and hidden the body. But the old trapper, Joseph Whitehorse, aged 67, who was half Blackfoot and knew the old stories, he told anyone who would listen that Nathaniel Frost hadn't died or gone mad. He had become something else entirely, had been transformed by grief into one of the old things, and he would haunt these forests forever, feeding on fear and pain because those were the only things he could still feel. For 143 years, the shadow had proven Joseph Whitehorse right. It existed in the spaces between light and dark, in the liminal moments of dawn and dusk, in the peripheral vision of anyone who ventured too close to the tree line where the Frost cabin had once stood. It had no body in the traditional sense, was instead a manifestation of condensed darkness that could take vaguely human shape when it chose, could spread itself thin across the forest floor, or concentrate itself into something almost solid, could whisper in voices that weren't quite voices and touch with fingers that weren't quite fingers. It fed on fear the way living things fed on food, drew sustenance from the terror it inspired, grew stronger with every scream, every racing heartbeat, every wide-eyed flight through the trees. Over the decades, it had developed techniques, had learned exactly how to appear in a window to cause maximum dread, had perfected the art of making footsteps follow people through the forest without ever being seen, had mastered the whisper that sounded like a loved one calling from just out of sight. It had driven 17 people to madness, had caused 32 people to flee the area permanently, and had fed off the low-level fear of hundreds more who felt watched whenever they walked in the woods, but could never quite explain why. The shadow told itself that this was justice, that it was making the Harker brothers' deaths last forever by inflicting their same brand of terror on an endless parade of victims, that every person it frightened was a small revenge for Rebecca, for Samuel, for Margaret. But the truth which it had been avoiding for more than a century was simpler and sadder. It did not feed on fear because it wanted revenge. It fed on fear because fear was the only thing that made it feel anything at all, because causing terror was the only way it could still connect with the living world, because in the absence of love and warmth and human connection, pain had become its only language. The shadow was not hunting for justice. It was hunting for proof that it still existed, that it still mattered, that it could still affect the world even though it was no longer part of it. Every scream was confirmation that it was real. Every terrified glance was acknowledgement that it had power. Every sleepless night it caused was evidence that Nathaniel Frost had not been completely erased by what had happened in that cabin, but none of it filled the emptiness where his family used to be. None of it brought back what he had lost, and none of it made him feel anything except the same cold hunger that drove him to seek out fear again and again and again. Then the Whitmore family had arrived 3 months ago, moving into the old Branson ranch that sat less than a mile from where the Frost cabin had stood. The shadow had watched them unload their moving truck on a warm August afternoon. Daniel Whitmore, age 39, a software engineer who'd taken a remote position so his family could leave Seattle's chaos for Montana's peace. Sarah Whitmore, age 37, a veterinarian who planned to open a practice in Whitefish. Their son Jackson, age 14, sullen and angry about being torn from his friends. And Emma, age 8, who had stepped out of the car and immediately turned to look at the tree line where the shadow was watching, as if she could sense something there even in broad daylight. The shadow had felt the familiar hunger rising, had recognized the opportunity for fresh terror, had begun planning how it would break this new family the way it had broken so many others. But something about Emma had given it pause. She looked nothing like Margaret Frost, had copper hair where Margaret's had been dark, had green eyes where Margaret's had been brown, had a serious expression where Margaret had always been smiling, but she moved through the world with the same openness, the same assumption that the universe was fundamentally friendly, the same fearlessness that came from never having been given a reason to be afraid. The shadow had watched Emma explore the property that first day, had tracked her as she investigated the old barn, peeked into the chicken coop, and finally wandered to the edge of the forest. It had prepared to make its presence known in subtle ways, to plant the first seeds of unease that it would cultivate over weeks and months into full-blown terror. But when Emma had stood at the tree line, she had not looked afraid. Instead, she had smiled, had said to the empty air, "I think I'm going to like it here," and had turned back to the house humming a melody that made something twist in what passed for the shadow's chest, because it was the same hymn Rebecca had sung while she cooked dinner on Sunday afternoons. The shadow had retreated deeper into the trees, had told itself it was simply adjusting its strategy, that there would be plenty of time to break this child's spirit, that patience made the fear taste better anyway. But the truth was that something about Emma's smile, about her voice, about the way she had spoken to the forest as if it might be listening, had disturbed the shadow in a way it hadn't been disturbed in over a century. Over the next 3 months, the shadow had observed the Whitmore family with an attention that went beyond predatory interest. It watched Daniel work in his home office, watched Sarah set up her veterinary practice in town, watched Jackson slowly begin to soften as he made friends at the local high school. But mostly, it watched Emma. She had started coming to the forest edge every Tuesday afternoon, always at the same time, always alone, and she would sit on a fallen log and talk. Not to anyone in particular, just talk, the way children do when they're processing their thoughts out loud. She talked about her new school, about missing her old friends, about the dog she hoped to get once her mom's practice was established, about the books she was reading and the stars she'd seen last night that you could never see in Seattle because of the light pollution. And sometimes when she was quiet, she would look directly at the shadows under the pines and say things like, "I know something sad happened here," or "I think someone is lonely," or "It's okay to be scared, but you don't have to stay scared forever." The shadow did not understand how this 8-year-old child could perceive what others missed, could sense its presence when it was being careful to remain hidden, could speak to it with such casual kindness as if it were not a monster that had terrorized these woods for over a century. Emma should have been afraid, should have felt the wrongness that every other sensitive person felt when they ventured too close to the shadow's territory, should have developed the nightmares and anxiety that the shadow usually cultivated in children. Instead, she seemed to draw comfort from her visits to the forest edge, seemed to find peace in the presence of something that should have been disturbing her profoundly. And the shadow found itself responding in ways it couldn't explain or control. It began to anticipate Emma's Tuesday visits, began to position itself where it could hear her more clearly, began to feel something other than hunger when she spoke. It was not a good feeling, not comfortable or pleasant, because mixed with the strange warmth of being acknowledged was the agony of remembering what it had been like to love and be loved, to have someone speak to you as if you mattered, to exist as something other than a source of terror. The shadow had been content, or at least resigned, to its existence as a creature of fear. It had accepted that Nathaniel Frost was gone, and that what remained was simply a predator, a thing that fed on the negative emotions of the living because that was what it was designed to do, because that was the only purpose it had. But Emma's presence was forcing it to remember that it had once been more than this, that Nathaniel Frost had been a man who loved his wife's laugh, who took pride in his son's drawings, who made up silly songs to make his daughter giggle, who believed in education and progress and the possibility of redemption. That man had been destroyed in a cabin in the winter of 1881, had been transformed into something monstrous by trauma, too enormous to contain, but some fragment of him must have remained because the shadow was finding it increasingly difficult to remember why it had wanted to terrorize Emma in the first place, why causing her fear had seemed like an acceptable response to her simple presence, why being acknowledged with kindness was somehow more disturbing than being feared with hatred. That Tuesday afternoon in October, when Emma looked directly at the shadow and said, "I know you're sad. I know you didn't mean to become this," something fundamental shifted in the darkness. The shadow had been seen before, had been glimpsed and feared and fled from, but it had never been recognized. No one had looked at it and seen past the monster to the pain that had created it, had acknowledged that its existence was not a choice but a consequence, that it was as much a victim of what had happened in that cabin as Rebecca and Samuel and Margaret had been. Emma's words were not an exorcism or a banishment or an attempt to destroy. They were simply an acknowledgement of truth, and that truth was more powerful than any fear the shadow had ever inspired. For the first time in 143 years, the shadow felt the possibility of being something other than what it had become. Felt the stirring of a question it had not dared to ask. If it had been transformed once, from man to monster, could it transform again into something else entirely? Before the shadow could process what Emma's recognition meant, before it could decide whether to retreat deeper into the forest or attempt some kind of response, Emma's older brother Jackson came crashing through the underbrush, calling her name with an edge of panic in his voice. He was 14 years old, gangly and awkward in the way of teenage boys, with the same copper hair as his sister but darker, more auburn, and eyes that held the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. The shadow had been observing Jackson over the past 3 months, had noted how the boy kept to himself, how he spent hours in his room with headphones on, how he seemed angry at the world for reasons that went beyond the normal teenage resentment of parental authority. There was a wound in Jackson, a hurt he carried that the shadow recognized because it lived in proximity to hurt of a different magnitude. And that recognition had made the shadow hesitate in its usual approach to corrupting the boy's sleep with nightmares. Now Jackson grabbed Emma's arm, yanking her away from the tree line with unnecessary force, his face flushed with a fear that had nothing to do with the supernatural. "For you can't just wander off like that," he hissed, his voice cracking between childhood and adulthood. "Mom and Dad are freaking out, and you know they're already stressed about money and the practice and everything. You can't just add to it by disappearing." Emma pulled her arm free, her expression shifting from serene to stubborn in an instant, that quick change children master when they're challenged. "I wasn't wandering off. I was right here. I come here every week. And I wasn't talking to myself, I was talking to—" She stopped, glanced at the shadows under the pines where the creature still pressed itself flat against the bark and seemed to make a decision. "I was talking to a friend," she finished quietly, and Jackson's face went through a complicated series of emotions that landed somewhere between exasperation and something that looked like pain. "I don't have any friends here yet," he said, and the shadow heard what he didn't say, which was that neither did he, that both of them were isolated in this new place in different ways, that moving to Montana had solved their parents' problems, but had created new ones for their children. Emma met her brother's eyes with a steadiness that seemed too old for 8 years and said, "Yes, I do. He's sad and lonely and scared, and he's been here a very long time, and just because you can't see him doesn't mean he's not real." The shadow felt something like electricity pass through its form, felt the weight of being called he instead of it, felt the recognition in Emma's words that despite everything it had become, it was still somehow, in some way, a person, rather than merely a thing. Jackson opened his mouth to argue, to tell his sister she was being ridiculous or childish or whatever words teenage boys use, to dismiss the insights of their younger siblings, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the absolute certainty in Emma's voice, or maybe it was the way the temperature had dropped several degrees since he'd entered the clearing, or maybe it was the crawling sensation on the back of his neck that told him they were being watched by something that had no interest in being seen. Whatever the reason, Jackson swallowed his response, took Emma's hand more gently this time, and said, "Come on, let's get back before it gets dark. You know these woods aren't safe." Emma allowed herself to be led away, but she looked back over her shoulder at the shadow one last time and said clearly, "I'll come back next Tuesday. I hope you'll listen again." Then the children disappeared through the trees, their voices fading into the distance, and the shadow was left alone with the weight of Emma's words settling over it like snow. That night, the shadow did something it had not done in over a century. Instead of prowling the edges of human habitation looking for fear to feed on, instead of pressing itself against windows or whispering in the ears of sleepers, it returned to the place where the frost cabin had once stood. There was nothing left of the structure now. 143 years and countless storms, and the slow work of decay had reduced it to a few stones that marked where the foundation had been, a depression in the earth where the root cellar had collapsed, some pieces of rusted metal that might have been tools or hinges, or the frame of a child's bed. The forest had reclaimed the clearing, had sent saplings shooting up through the floorboards until they became trees, had covered the blood and ash and grief with layers of pine needles and moss and the clean forgetting of nature. But the shadow remembered every detail, could superimpose the memory of the cabin over the reality of the forest as clearly as if no time had passed at all. It could see Rebecca at the stove, could hear Samuel reading aloud from one of his bird books, could feel Margaret tugging on what used to be its sleeve, asking to be lifted up so she could see out the window. The memories were agony, were the kind of pain that should have destroyed consciousness, but the shadow had learned long ago that it could not escape into unconsciousness or madness, that it was trapped in perfect awareness of everything it had lost, that this was part of its punishment and its nature. But tonight, for the first time, the shadow did not try to avoid the memories. Instead, it let them wash over it, let itself remember not just the horror of how it ended, but the beauty of what had been before. Nathaniel Frost had loved his wife with the kind of devotion that made every moment precious, had felt genuine pride in his son's curiosity and intelligence, had been wrapped around his daughter's little finger in the way fathers of girls always are. He had built this cabin with his own hands, had chosen this spot because Rebecca said she could imagine playing piano here while looking out at the mountains, had cut each log and fit each stone and driven each nail with the knowledge that he was building more than a house, he was building a life. The man he had been believed in progress, in education, in the fundamental goodness of humanity, believed that the frontier was a place where people could start fresh and build something better than what they'd left behind. That man had been wrong, had been destroyed by the cruelty of the Harker brothers and the realization that the world was not fundamentally good, that innocent people could suffer for no reason, that love was not armor against violence. But that man had also been real, had existed, had mattered, and maybe acknowledging that was the first step toward something Emma had implied without saying directly, that what you had become was not all that you were, that transformation did not have to be permanent, that even monsters could remember what it felt like to be human. The shadow spent that night among the remnants of its former life, not feeding on fear or hunting for victims, simply existing in proximity to memory and grief, and when dawn came, it felt something it had not felt in over a century. Not hope exactly, because hope was still too foreign and fragile a thing for a creature made of darkness and despair, but perhaps the possibility of hope, the faintest suggestion that its existence might serve some purpose beyond inflicting pain, that Emma's recognition had opened a door to something other than the endless cycle of hunger and fear and temporary satiation that never quite satisfied. The shadow did not know what it would do with this possibility, did not know if transformation was even achievable for something that had been monstrous for so long, but it knew that when Tuesday came, it would be waiting at the tree line, and it would listen to whatever Emma had to say. Tuesday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made Montana's beauty almost painful to behold. The morning had been cold enough to frost the grass, but by afternoon the sun had warmed everything to that perfect temperature where you could wear a sweater without being too hot or too cold, where the air smelled like pine and wood smoke and the particular sweetness of leaves preparing to fall. Emma came to the forest edge exactly at 4:47 p.m., right on schedule, and this time the shadow was ready for her. It had positioned itself in a patch of dappled sunlight, had concentrated its form just enough to be substantial without being threatening, had gathered what courage a creature made of darkness could possess, and prepared to do something it had never attempted before, to be seen not as a terror but as itself. When Emma sat down on her usual log and looked directly at the shadow, she did not scream or run. Instead, she smiled, a small, gentle expression that held no fear, and said, "I knew you'd be here. I told Jackson about you, and he thinks I'm making you up, but I know I'm not. Can you hear me?" The shadow, which had spent 143 years perfecting the art of whispers and suggestions and half-heard threats, found that when it tried to speak with honest communication rather than manipulation, it had almost forgotten how. But it managed a single word, pushed through the barrier between its world and hers, a whisper that sounded like wind through empty rooms. Yes. Emma's eyes went wide, but not with fear, with delight, the way a child looks when they've discovered something magical and secret, when the world has revealed itself to be stranger and more wonderful than they'd been told. "You can talk," she breathed, and the shadow felt the weight of her attention like warmth, like the memory of sunlight on skin that it had not felt since it had ceased to have skin. I wasn't sure if you could, or if you'd want to, but I'm really glad you do. Do you have a name? The question was so simple, so human, so achingly normal, that the shadow felt something crack in what passed for its chest. It had not spoken its name aloud in over a century, had not thought of itself as Nathaniel Frost in so long that the name felt like something from another life, something that belonged to someone who no longer existed. But Emma had asked, and Emma had called it a friend. And Emma seemed to believe that even monsters deserved the basic dignity of having a name. So the shadow gathered itself and whispered, "Nathaniel. I was Nathaniel Frost." Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense, as if being introduced to a sentient shadow in the Montana wilderness was a normal Tuesday afternoon occurrence, and said, "I'm Emma Whitmore. I'm 8 years old. I think we're going to be friends, Nathaniel." Over the next hour, Emma talked, and the shadow listened, and occasionally the shadow managed to whisper a response, and slowly, carefully, they built the foundation of something that neither of them quite had words for yet. Emma told Nathaniel about her old life in Seattle, about the friends she missed, about how her parents were stressed because money was tight and her mom's veterinary practice was taking longer to establish than they'd hoped, about how Jackson was angry all the time now because he'd had to leave his girlfriend behind and didn't think he'd ever find anyone in this middle-of-nowhere place. She talked about school, about how she liked her teacher, Mrs. Peterson, who was 63 years old and had taught in Whitefish for 40 years, about the boy named Caleb who pulled her braids, about how she'd joined the art club even though she wasn't very good at drawing, because at least it was something to do after school. And woven through all of it was a loneliness that the shadow recognized because it was the same loneliness it had been carrying for over a century, the feeling of being disconnected from everything around you, of being present but not belonging, of having lost something essential and not knowing if you'd ever find it again. When Emma paused for breath, the shadow asked a question it had not planned to ask, a question that came from some part of Nathaniel Frost that had survived the transformation. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" Emma tilted her head, considering, and the shadow could see her thinking, could see the way she took the question seriously rather than dismissing it. "I think," she said slowly, "it's because you're not trying to be scary right now. When I first felt you watching, it was kind of creepy, like when you know someone's looking at you but you can't see them. But then I started paying attention, and I realized you weren't trying to hurt me. You were just there. And being there isn't the same as being scary." Also, she added with the kind of logic only children possess, "My grandma died last year, and sometimes I feel her around me, and that's not scary even though she's dead, so why should you be scary just because you're different?" The shadow had no answer for this, had never encountered someone who approached the supernatural with such pragmatic acceptance, who could acknowledge the strangeness of communicating with a sentient darkness without letting that strangeness become fear. The shadow wanted to tell Emma that she should be afraid, that it had spent over a century being a thing of terror, that it had broken minds and caused suffering and was not safe or good or anything that a child should be talking to. It wanted to warn her that the kindness she was showing would not change what it was, that monsters did not transform into heroes just because someone treated them with decency, that she was risking herself by being here. But before it could formulate the warning into whispered words, the forest around them changed. It was subtle at first, the way the birds went quiet, the way the temperature dropped just slightly, the way the shadows seemed to deepen in places they shouldn't. The shadow recognized these signs because they were the ones it usually created, but it was not creating them now, which meant something else was approaching, something that had learned to move through the wilderness without making sound, something that had ill intentions. The shadow expanded its awareness, spreading itself thin across the forest floor, and found them. 2 men, ages 31 and 28, moving through the trees with the deliberate stealth of predators who knew exactly where they were going. They were both armed, both dressed in hunting camouflage, and both carrying an energy that the shadow recognized from 143 years ago, the particular combination of cruel amusement and anticipated violence that had surrounded the Harker brothers like a smell. The shadow condensed itself back into concentrated form and whispered urgently to Emma, "Go, now, run home. Men coming. Dangerous." But Emma, with the stubbornness of children who have not yet learned that adults can be trusted to handle dangerous situations, shook her head. "What men? I don't see anyone. Are you sure?" The shadow wanted to scream at her, wanted to manifest fully and terrify her into running. Wanted to use every trick it had learned over a century to make her flee in panic, because panic would at least get her moving. But it could not bring itself to frighten this child who had shown it kindness, could not bear to see fear replace the trust in her eyes, could not become the monster again, even though being the monster might save her life. Instead, it whispered desperately, "Please, Emma, trust me, not safe. You need to go." And maybe it was the please, or maybe it was the genuine fear in the shadow's voice, or maybe Emma was smarter than her 8 years suggested, but she stood up from the log and started backing toward the path that led home, her eyes wide, but still not quite afraid, still looking at the shadow like it was her friend who was trying to protect her, rather than a monster she should be fleeing from. The shadow watched Emma retreat toward safety, felt relief beginning to uncurl in what passed for its chest, and then heard one of the men's voices cut through the forest. "Well, look at that. Thought we'd have to wait till dark, but the little girl's come right to us." The two men stepped out from behind trees about 50 yards from where Emma had been sitting, moving with the confidence of people who knew they had the advantage, who had probably been watching for some time, who had calculated their approach and their timing, and had decided that a single child alone in the woods was easy prey. The older one, Marcus Webb, had dead eyes and a smile that didn't reach them, was wearing an orange hunting vest over a black shirt, had hands that moved to his belt in a way that suggested he'd done this kind of thing before. The younger one, Tyler Reed, was laughing nervously, kept glancing at his companion for cues, seemed less certain but equally dangerous because uncertain people do terrible things to prove themselves to those they admire. And the shadow, watching these two men approach Emma with that same casual cruelty it had seen in the Harker brothers, felt something fundamental click into place in what remained of its consciousness. For 143 years, it had been asking the wrong question. It had been asking, why did this happen to me? When the real question was, what am I going to do about it happening to someone else? Emma had frozen when the men appeared, her child's brain trying to process the cognitive dissonance of adult men in the woods who felt wrong in ways she didn't have words for yet, men who should not be looking at an 8-year-old girl the way they were looking at her. The shadow saw her starting to shake, saw her hands clenching into fists, saw the beginning of the trauma that would reshape her understanding of the world, and something in what remained of Nathaniel Frost's consciousness said no. Not this child, not this innocence, not again. For over a century, the shadow had used fear as a weapon against the innocent, had cultivated terror in people who had done nothing to deserve it, had become the very thing it hated because it had forgotten what it meant to stand between harm and the helpless. But Emma had reminded it, had looked at the monster and seen the man underneath, had offered friendship to darkness, and in doing so had illuminated a path the shadow had thought was closed forever. And if transformation was possible, if a creature made of grief and rage could choose to be something other than what it had been forced to become, then it could start by doing what Nathaniel Frost would have done if he had still been alive when men with cruel intentions approached his daughter. The shadow manifested, not subtly, not with the careful manipulation of peripheral vision and suggestion and psychological manipulation it had perfected over more than a century, but fully, completely, with every ounce of concentrated darkness it could gather into one place. It rose from the forest floor between Emma and the two men, pulled itself into a shape that was almost human, but too tall, too thin, too wrong in all the ways that bypassed rational thought and triggered the animal hindbrain that remembered when humans were prey. It was darkness given form, was the absence of light made solid, was every nightmare about things in the dark given substance and intention. Marcus Webb's smile disappeared, his face going slack with an animal terror that bypassed every defense and went straight to the part of the brain that understood predators. Tyler Reed made a sound that was not quite a scream, his nervous laughter cutting off mid-breath. And the shadow spoke, not in whispers but in a voice like grinding stone, like the creaking of frozen trees, like the sound bones make when they break. A voice that carried 143 years of rage and grief and hunger. Leave, now, or learn what fear truly means. Marcus Webb, to his credit, or perhaps his doom, did not run immediately. He was a career criminal, had spent 12 years in and out of prison for assault and robbery, and worse, had developed the kind of calloused disregard for threat that comes from surviving violent encounters. He pulled a hunting knife from his belt, held it in a way that suggested he knew how to use it, and tried to laugh though it came out wrong, strangled and uncertain. What the hell is this? Some kind of trick? Someone trying to scare us with lights and mirrors? The shadow did not respond with words. Instead, it reached out with what passed for its hand, and where it touched, frost formed on the trees, on the air itself, spreading in crystalline patterns that looked like screaming faces. It showed Marcus Webb a fraction of what it could do, a glimpse of the decades it had spent perfecting the art of psychological and spiritual destruction, and in that glimpse, Marcus saw every victim he had ever hurt, every person he had terrorized, every life he had damaged, all of them staring back at him with eyes that promised a reckoning. Tyler Reed had already started backing away, his bravado completely evaporated, his breath coming in gasping sobs, but Marcus held his ground for 3 more seconds, his pride and his violence wrestling with his survival instinct, before the shadow leaned closer and whispered directly into his mind things that should not be possible to know, secrets about Marcus's childhood, about what had been done to him and what he had become because of it, about the darkness he carried that recognized the darkness standing before him. Then Marcus broke, dropped the knife and ran, crashing through the underbrush with Tyler close behind him, both men fleeing like children from the dark. The shadow watched them go, made sure they were truly gone, spreading its awareness wide to track them for a quarter mile before they reached their truck and peeled out with tires screaming on gravel. Only then did it turn back to Emma, who had not run, who had stayed frozen in place with her copper braids disheveled and her green eyes enormous in her pale face, who was shaking but not, the shadow realized, entirely with fear. "Nathaniel," she said in a small voice, and the shadow felt the weight of that name like an anchor, like something solid it could hold on to. It pulled itself back, condensed the darkness, shaped itself into something less terrible, less overwhelming, tried to make itself into something that would not traumatize this child who had shown it kindness. When it spoke, it was in whispers again, gentle and careful. "I'm sorry you had to see that, but those men, they wanted to hurt you. I couldn't let that happen." Emma took a shaky breath, wrapped her arms around herself and said words the shadow would never forget. "Thank you for protecting me. I know that must have been hard for you, to be scary like that when you're trying not to be scary anymore." The shadow had no response to this, had not expected to be understood so completely by an 8-year-old child, had not anticipated that Emma would recognize the cost of what it had just done. For over a century, being terrifying had been effortless, natural, the core of its existence, but using that terror to protect rather than to harm had required something different, had required choosing to be monstrous for a purpose rather than simply existing as a monster. And Emma had seen that choice, had recognized the intention behind the action, had understood that the shadow was trying to become something other than what it had been. "You should go home now," the shadow whispered. "Tell your parents what happened. Those men may come back, not safe for you to be in the woods alone." But Emma shook her head, still hugging herself, still shaking slightly, but with something like determination in her voice. "If I tell my parents, they won't let me come back here. They'll say it's too dangerous, and then I won't get to see you anymore, and you'll be alone again." The shadow felt something twist in its chest, felt the weight of this child caring about its loneliness, even after she'd been terrified, even after she'd nearly been harmed, even after she'd seen what the shadow could become when it chose to manifest its full power. "Emma," the shadow said, trying to find words for something it had never tried to express before, "I have been alone for 143 years. I have been a thing of terror and pain. You should not care about my loneliness. You should be afraid of me." Emma looked up at the shadow, and even though it had pulled itself into a less threatening form, it was still a manifestation of darkness that defied natural law, still something that should not exist, still a being made of grief and rage and supernatural hunger. But Emma looked at it with those clear green eyes and said simply, "But you saved me. Monsters don't save people. Friends do. And I told you we're going to be friends." Then she did something that the shadow would later recognize as the moment its transformation became irrevocable. She reached out and put her small hand directly into the patch of concentrated darkness that served as the shadow's form. She could not touch it in any physical sense. Her hand passed through it as if through smoke, but the intention was clear, the gesture of trust was unmistakable, and the shadow felt the warmth of her living energy pass through what it was, felt the contrast between her vitality and its deathlessness, felt something it had not felt since Rebecca had held Nathaniel Frost's hand on their wedding day. It felt connection. Emma kept her promise not to tell her parents exactly what had happened, but she did tell them that she'd seen some weird men in the woods who had made her uncomfortable, and she let her father Daniel call the county sheriff to report suspicious activity in the area. The sheriff, Robert Hayes, age 56, took the report seriously, because there had been other incidents lately, other reports of two men in hunting gear harassing hikers and campers, and the description Emma gave of Marcus Webb and Tyler Reed matched the descriptions from those other reports. Within a week, both men had been arrested on outstanding warrants from Idaho and would not be bothering anyone in Montana for a long time. But Emma's restraint in not explaining exactly how she'd been protected, exactly what had intervened between her and those men, meant that her parents did not forbid her from visiting the forest edge. They simply insisted that Jackson go with her from now on and that they stay where they could see the house. This new arrangement should have frustrated the shadow, should have made communication with Emma more difficult, but instead it opened an unexpected door. Jackson Whitmore had been skeptical of his sister's claims about her forest friend, had dismissed it as the kind of imaginary companion lonely children create, but he had also been shaken by the incident with the men in the woods in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He had not been there, had been at school when it happened, but the thought of Emma alone and vulnerable had triggered something protective in him that surprised him with its intensity. So when Emma insisted on returning to the forest edge the following Tuesday, Jackson went with her, half to protect her, and half because he was curious despite himself about what she'd been doing out here every week. The shadow watched them approach, brother and sister, and felt a pang of something like memory watching the way Jackson positioned himself between Emma and the tree line, the way he scanned the forest with wary eyes, the way he was trying to be brave and adult and protective, even though he was only 14 and scared. It reminded the shadow of Samuel, of the way Nathaniel's son had tried to be the man of the house when Nathaniel was at school, had taken his responsibilities seriously in that solemn way boys do when they want their fathers to be proud of them. Emma sat on her usual log and spoke to the shadows as if Jackson weren't there, her voice carrying that particular note children use when they're performing naturalness to prove a point. "Hi, Nathaniel. I brought my brother Jackson. He doesn't believe you're real, but I thought maybe you could show him. He's sad too, even though he doesn't talk about it. I think you two might understand each other." Jackson rolled his eyes with the elaborate exasperation of teenagers dealing with their younger siblings, but the shadow noticed the way his body tensed, the way his eyes kept darting to the deeper shadows under the pines, the way he was afraid in a way that went beyond the general unease most people felt in the presence of the unknown. The shadow could taste Jackson's fear, could feel the familiar hunger rising in response, could recognize the opportunity to feed that it had been trained by 143 years to pursue. But it remembered Emma's hand reaching into its darkness, remembered the trust in her voice when she'd called it a friend, remembered the way protecting her had felt different from terrifying her, and it made a choice. Instead of feeding on Jackson's fear, it would try to ease it. The shadow manifested slowly, carefully appearing in the dappled sunlight as a concentration of darkness that was undeniably present, but not overwhelming, not threatening, just there. Jackson's sharp intake of breath was audible, his hand moving instinctively to his pocket, where the shadow knew he kept a folding knife their father had given him for camping. But Emma reached over and put her hand on her brother's arm, grounding him, keeping him from running or doing something stupid out of panic. "It's okay," she said quietly. "He won't hurt you. He saved me from those men. His name is Nathaniel Frost, And he used to be a person, and something really sad happened to him, and now he's stuck being a shadow. But he's still a person inside, even if he looks different on the outside. The shadow felt the weight of Emma's simple explanation, felt the way she reduced 143 years of supernatural existence to its essential truth. Something sad had happened, and it had changed who he was, but person and shadow were not mutually exclusive categories. Jackson stared at the patch of darkness that was clearly not behaving the way shadows were supposed to behave, was clearly something impossible and frightening and real, and the shadow could see him trying to reconcile the evidence of his eyes with his understanding of how the world worked. "This is insane," Jackson said finally, his voice cracking slightly. "This is actually insane. Em, we need to tell Mom and Dad. I don't know what this is, but it's not normal." "Normal is overrated," Emma said with the absolute certainty of 8-year-olds who haven't yet learned to doubt themselves. "And besides, just because something's different doesn't mean it's bad. You're always telling me not to judge people by how they look or where they come from. Why is Nathaniel different?" It was a fair point, delivered with the particular logic children use to hold adults to their own stated principles, and Jackson had no good answer for it. The shadow decided to help, gathering what courage it had and whispering in a voice that Jackson could hear. "Your sister is right. I will not harm you. I have been. Trying to be different, to be better than what I became." Jackson flinched at the sound of the shadow's voice, that whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that should not exist, but clearly did. But he did not run. Instead, he asked the question the shadow had been waiting for someone to ask. "What happened to you? Emma says something sad happened, but what could turn someone into this?" And for the first time in over a century, the shadow found itself wanting to tell the truth, wanting to share the burden of its history, wanting to be known for something more than the terror it inspired. So the shadow told them. Not the full story, not the graphic details that would haunt their dreams, but the essential truth, that there had been a teacher named Nathaniel Frost who loved his family, that evil men had destroyed that family and him with it, that grief and rage had transformed him into something that should not exist, that he had spent more than a century being a creature of terror because terror was the only way he could still feel anything. And it told them about Emma, about how her kindness and recognition had given it the first glimpse in over a century of another way to exist, about how protecting her from the men in the woods had reminded it what it felt like to be human rather than monster. Jackson listened with the kind of intense attention that adolescents give to things that confirm their suspicion that the adult world has been lying to them, that reality is stranger and darker and more complicated than anyone admits. When the shadow finished, Jackson was quiet for a long moment before he said something unexpected. "My dad says that grief can eat you alive if you let it, that you have to find a way to live with it or it'll destroy you. I think maybe what happened to you is the worst version of that. Like grief literally eating you until there was nothing left but the grief itself." The shadow had never heard its existence described quite that way, but Jackson's words resonated with a truth the shadow had been avoiding. It had not been consumed by grief so much as it had become grief, had allowed the loss of its family to become the totality of its identity, had fed its pain for so long that it had forgotten there had ever been anything else to feed. Emma looked thoughtful, processing her brother's words with that serious expression children get when they're trying to understand something important. And then she said, "But grief doesn't have to eat you forever, right? Like, you can feed it something else instead. You can remember the people you loved without only being sad about losing them." It was such a simple observation, delivered with such casual wisdom, that the shadow felt something crack wide open inside what passed for its chest. For 143 years, it had honored Rebecca, Samuel, and Margaret by becoming a monster, by ensuring that their deaths were marked by eternal suffering, by making the world pay for their loss. But Emma was suggesting something radical, that honoring the dead might mean remembering the joy of loving them, rather than just the agony of losing them, that carrying their memory forward might mean becoming something that would make them proud, rather than something that would horrify them. Over the following weeks, Emma and Jackson became regular visitors to the forest edge, and slowly, carefully, the shadow began to remember what it meant to have relationships that were not based on fear. Emma would talk about her day, about school and friends, and the small dramas of childhood, and the shadow would listen and occasionally whisper responses, offering the kind of gentle guidance that Nathaniel Frost would have given his own daughter. Jackson, who was more reserved, would sometimes sit in silence, would sometimes ask questions about what it was like to be trapped between worlds, would sometimes share his own struggles with moving to Montana, with missing his girlfriend Sophia from Seattle, who was 16 and had promised to wait for him, but probably wouldn't, with feeling like he didn't fit anywhere. And the shadow, which had spent over a century alone, found itself becoming something like the thing Emma had declared it to be: a friend. Not a monster to be feared, not a supernatural curiosity to be studied, but simply a presence that listened and cared and remembered what it meant to be connected to the living world. The transformation was not easy or simple. There were days when the old hunger rose up, and the shadow wanted to feed on their fear, wanted to slip into their dreams and harvest their nightmares, wanted to return to the comfortable certainty of being a predator. There were moments when it manifested too strongly and frightened them despite its intentions, when it forgot how to modulate its presence and became overwhelming. And there were times when the grief that had made it was so powerful that it could barely hold itself together, when the memories of Rebecca and Samuel and Margaret were so vivid that it wanted to disperse entirely, to let itself dissolve back into the formless darkness from which it had emerged. But Emma and Jackson kept coming back, kept treating the shadow as if it were capable of change, kept believing that the monster could learn to be something else, and their faith became a kind of anchor that the shadow could hold on to when everything else felt impossible. Then, on a cold November evening, something happened that would test everything the shadow had learned about protecting rather than terrorizing. Daniel and Sarah Whitmore had gone to dinner in Whitefish, leaving Jackson to watch Emma for the evening, and the shadow had been observing the house from its usual position at the tree line, not because it was stalking them, but because it had developed something like protective vigilance over the family. Around 9 p.m., when Emma should have been getting ready for bed, the shadow sensed something wrong. A vehicle approaching the house, moving slowly without headlights, stopping about 50 yards down the road. 2 people getting out, moving toward the house with deliberate stealth. The shadow expanded its awareness and recognized them with a cold certainty. Marcus Webb and Tyler Reed, who should have been in custody but had apparently made bail, who had clearly tracked down Emma's family, who were approaching the house with tools and terrible intentions. The shadow faced a choice. It could slip into the house, could warn Jackson and Emma, could rely on them to call the police and lock the doors and handle this in a rational, legal, civilized way. But it knew that by the time police arrived from town, Marcus and Tyler would have broken in, would have done what they came to do, would have destroyed another family the way the Harker brothers had destroyed the Frosts. Or the shadow could do what it had been created to do, could use the full extent of its power not for feeding but for protecting, could become the monster again, but this time with purpose, with intention, with the knowledge that what it was about to do was not cruelty but justice. The shadow had spent over a century asking what it was, but Emma had taught it to ask a different question. What did it want to be? And the answer came with perfect clarity. It wanted to be the thing that stood between harm and the helpless, wanted to be the guardian that Nathaniel Frost had failed to be for his own family, wanted to transform its grief from a weapon against the innocent into a shield for those who needed protecting. The shadow manifested fully for only the second time since Emma had called it friend, pulling every particle of darkness it could gather into concentrated form, rising from the forest floor like a pillar of night given substance and will. Marcus Webb saw it first, saw the darkness moving toward him with terrible purpose, and the shadow felt him recognize it from their previous encounter, felt the fear bloom in Marcus's chest like a flower of frost. Tyler Reed tried to run immediately, his courage exhausted by the first appearance, and completely absent for the second, but the shadow was faster, was everywhere at once, was darkness given form and hunger and intention. It did not touch them, did not physically harm them because that would make it the thing it was trying not to be. Instead, it showed them. It pulled them into a vision of their own futures, showed them what would happen if they continued on this path, showed them every victim they would claim, every life they would ruin, every moment of suffering they would cause, and then it showed them the inevitable end, prison cells and lonely deaths and the weight of all that harm pressing down until there was nothing left but regret and wasted years. And woven through the vision was a single message, repeated with the weight of 143 years of supernatural will. Leave this family alone. Leave this place. If you return, I will not be merciful again. Marcus Webb and Tyler Reed ran, fled into the night with the taste of their own future bitter in their mouths. And the shadow knew they would not return, could feel the way the vision had broken something in them, could sense that they would leave Montana and never speak of what had happened here because to speak of it would be to remember it. And the memory itself was punishment enough. The shadow watched them go, felt the familiar hunger that came from inspiring such profound terror, felt the temptation to follow them, to feed, to return to what it had been. But then it felt something else. Emma's presence at the window of the house, her face pressed against the glass, her small hand raised in a wave that the shadow could sense, even though she couldn't possibly see it clearly in the darkness. She knew what it had done, knew that it had protected her family again, knew that the shadow was choosing to be different, even when being different was harder than being the monster. And that knowledge, that recognition, was more sustaining than fear had ever been. The shadow returned to the tree line and waited for the Whitmore parents to come home, watched through windows as Jackson and Emma went to bed, observed the normal rhythms of family life with something that felt dangerously close to contentment. For the first time in 143 years, it had used its power for something other than inflicting pain, had channeled the rage and grief that had made it into protection rather than predation, had been the guardian that Nathaniel Frost had wanted to be, but had failed to become when his family needed him most. It was not redemption exactly, because redemption seemed too large and too distant a goal for a creature made of darkness and trauma. But it was perhaps the first step on a path towards something else, some third option between monster and man, some way of existing that honored both what it had been and what it had become without being trapped by either identity. Winter came to Montana with the kind of brutal beauty that defined the region, snow falling in thick curtains, temperatures dropping until the forest cracked and groaned with cold, winds howling through the pines with voices that sounded almost human. Emma and Jackson could not visit the forest edges regularly once the snow got deep, but they found other ways to maintain their connection with the shadow. Emma would wave to the tree line from her bedroom window before bed, would leave small drawings tucked under rocks at the forest's edge, would speak to the darkness when she was outside building snowmen or helping her father clear the driveway. Jackson, who had been researching local history with the intensity of someone who needed to understand, had found references to the Frost family in old newspaper archives, had discovered the story of what had happened in 1881, had put together the connection between that tragedy and the shadow's existence. He shared what he'd learned with Emma, and together they had mourned for Rebecca and Samuel and Margaret Frost, had acknowledged that the monster in the woods was also a victim, that trauma could transform people in ways that defied natural law, that grief was powerful enough to reshape reality itself. The shadow, in turn, had been learning to exist in proximity to the Whitmore family without feeding on them, to observe their joys and sorrows without harvesting them for sustenance, to be present without being predatory. It was harder than it had anticipated, required constant vigilance against old habits, required choosing every day to be something other than what it had been for over a century. There were setbacks, moments when the hunger overwhelmed intention, and the shadow found itself whispering into Sarah's dreams or casting unsettling shadows in Daniel's peripheral vision before it caught itself and pulled back. But each time it managed to resist the urge to feed, each time it chose presence over predation, it felt something shift in what passed for its consciousness, felt itself becoming marginally more like the man who had built a cabin and believed in the goodness of the world, and less like the creature that had haunted these woods for over a century. On Christmas Eve, Emma did something that would mark another turning point in the shadow's transformation. She convinced her parents to let her place a small electric candle at the forest's edge, told them it was for someone who's alone and might need to see light. Sarah and Daniel Whitmore, who had been raised Christian but weren't particularly religious, thought it was a sweet gesture, a sign of their daughter's kind heart, and they helped her place the candle in a protected spot where the snow wouldn't smother it. But the shadow knew what Emma was really doing, knew that she was marking the place where the frost cabin had stood, was creating a memorial for Rebecca and Samuel and Margaret, was acknowledging their deaths and Nathaniel's transformation in the only way an 8-year-old could. When the family went back inside and the candle flickered in the darkness, the shadow approached it slowly, carefully, drawn to the light in a way it had not been drawn to anything in over a century. The light should have been painful, should have been antithetical to something made of darkness, should have been repellent in the way that holy symbols supposedly repelled vampires or sunlight destroyed shadows. But Emma's candle was not meant to destroy or repel. It was meant to acknowledge, to witness, to remember, and the shadow found that it could exist in proximity to that kind of light without being diminished. In fact, the light seemed to make its form more stable, seemed to give it a clearer sense of itself, seemed to create a boundary between shadow and darkness that allowed Nathaniel Frost to be something distinct rather than just an undifferentiated mass of grief and hunger. The shadow stood by Emma's candle through that Christmas Eve night, and it remembered other Christmas Eves when Rebecca had played carols on the piano and Samuel had been allowed to stay up late to help decorate, and Margaret had been so excited she could barely sleep. Those memories still hurt, still carried the weight of everything that had been lost, but next to Emma's candle, the shadow found that it could remember the joy alongside the pain, could hold both the happiness of what had been and the sorrow of what had ended, without being destroyed by the contradiction. As winter deepened and then began to loosen its grip, as the days slowly lengthened, and the first signs of spring appeared in the forests of Montana, the shadow continued to change in ways both subtle and profound. It learned to communicate more easily with Emma and Jackson, to shape whispers into actual words, rather than just impressions and emotions, to hold conversations that were almost normal if you ignored the fact that one participant was a sentient mass of darkness. It learned to modulate its presence so that it could be detected when it wanted to be and invisible when the situation required, to move through the forest without disturbing the animals, to exist in proximity to the Whitmore family without inadvertently frightening them. And perhaps most importantly, it learned to find purpose beyond terror, to experience something like satisfaction from protecting rather than from hunting, to measure its existence by what it preserved rather than what it destroyed. Emma turned 9 in March, and the shadow did something it had not done in 143 years. It created something rather than destroying something. Using the frost and shadow it could manipulate, it shaped a gift for Emma, a delicate sculpture of ice and darkness in the form of a bird, something like the drawings Samuel used to make, something beautiful and temporary, and offered with no expectation of anything in return. Emma found it at the forest's edge on the morning of her birthday, brought it inside in cupped hands before it could melt completely, and showed it to her family with such delight that the shadow felt something warm unfurl in what passed for its chest. "Nathaniel made this for me," she announced with absolute certainty, and while Sarah and Daniel exchanged looks that suggested they still thought their daughter's forest friend was mostly imagination, they praised the ice sculpture and took pictures before it melted. And that was enough. Jackson graduated from middle school that spring and would be starting high school in the fall, and he confided to the shadow that he was thinking about studying folklore and anthropology in college, was fascinated by the intersection of story and supernatural, was trying to understand how people made sense of experiences that defied rational explanation. The shadow encouraged this, whispered suggestions about books to read and questions to explore, and felt something like pride in the boy's intellectual curiosity, in his refusal to dismiss what he'd experienced just because it didn't fit conventional understanding. Sarah's veterinary practice finally started to take off as word spread about her skill and compassion, and Daniel's remote work had proven stable enough that the financial stress that had shadowed the family's first months in Montana had begun to ease. The Whitmores were putting down roots, were becoming part of the community, were transforming from newcomers into residents, and the shadow watched it all with something that felt increasingly like protective affection. Then, on a warm June evening when the light lingered until almost 10 p.m., and the air smelled like pine sap and wildflowers. Emma came to the forest edge alone. She had asked Jackson to stay home, had told her parents she wanted to walk before bed, and the shadow could sense that she had something important to say. She sat on her usual log, now weathered by a year of visits, and looked at the shadows under the pines with an expression that held both determination and sadness. "Nathaniel," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about something and I need to ask you about it. Is it okay if I ask you a hard question?" The shadow condensed itself into visibility, manifesting in the last rays of evening sunlight as a concentration of darkness that Emma had long since stopped finding frightening. "You may ask anything," it whispered, and it meant it, because Emma had earned the right to know anything she wanted to know, had earned honesty and vulnerability, and whatever truth the shadow could offer. Emma took a breath, picking at the bark of the log with fingers that betrayed her nervousness, and asked the question the shadow had been waiting for someone to ask. "Are you stuck being a shadow? Like, is this permanent? Or could you change into something else if you wanted to? Could you stop being this?" The shadow had no immediate answer, had not allowed itself to seriously consider the question of whether its transformation was reversible, whether the thing it had become could somehow revert to being the man it had been. The folklore was unclear on this point. The old stories about shapeshifters and cursed creatures suggested both permanent transformations and ones that could be broken, but those were stories, and the shadow's existence was something else entirely. It had been born from trauma so profound it had literally torn a hole in reality, had been shaped by grief too enormous to be contained in a human form, had spent over a century feeding on fear until terror had become as essential to its existence as breath had once been. The idea that such a transformation could simply be undone seemed impossible, seemed like wishful thinking, seemed like the kind of hope that led to devastating disappointment. But Emma was looking at it with those clear green eyes, waiting for an honest answer, and the shadow owed her honesty. "I don't know," it whispered finally, the words carrying 143 years of uncertainty and longing and fear. "I have been this for so long that I don't remember how to be anything else. The man I was died in that cabin with his family. What remained became this. I do not know if transformation can go backward, if grief can be unmade, if monsters can become men again." Emma nodded slowly, processing this, and then she said something that cut through all the shadow's careful defenses. "But you've already changed. You used to be a scary thing that hurt people, and now you're my friend who protects people. If you can change from monster to guardian, why couldn't you change from shadow to person?" It was the kind of logic only children possess, the kind of faith in transformation that adults lose when they learn that some damage is permanent, some wounds don't heal, some changes can't be reversed. But the shadow had spent a year learning to see the world through Emma's eyes, had discovered that her perspective often held truths that the shadow's cynicism missed, had found that her hope was grounded not in naivety, but in a clear-eyed recognition of what was possible. "What would you have me do?" the shadow asked, genuinely curious, genuinely willing to listen, because if transformation was possible, Emma would know how to approach it. Emma thought for a moment, her face scrunching up with the concentration of someone working through a complex problem, and then she said, "I think you need to forgive yourself, not for what happened to your family, because that wasn't your fault, but for what you became after, for all the people you scared, for all the years you spent being alone and angry. I think you're holding on to the monster part because you think that's what you deserve, but maybe you deserve to be happy too. Maybe your family would want you to be happy again." The shadow felt something crack inside what passed for its chest, felt 143 years of self-punishment and carefully maintained suffering begin to crumble under the weight of Emma's simple observation. She was right, of course. The shadow had held on to its monstrous nature, not because it had to, but because it believed it should, because becoming a creature of terror had been a form of penance, because suffering was how it honored the dead. But Rebecca had loved music and laughter, and the sound of rain on the cabin roof. Samuel had been curious about everything, had believed the world was full of wonders waiting to be discovered. Margaret had made friends with every living thing she encountered, had approached life with joy and openness. None of them would have wanted Nathaniel to spend more than a century as a monster, would have wanted him to transform his love for them into a weapon against the world, would have wanted their deaths to be marked by eternal suffering. If there was any honor to be found in carrying their memory forward, it was in becoming someone who would make them proud, someone who protected the innocent the way Nathaniel had failed to protect them, someone who chose light over darkness even when darkness felt more comfortable. How does one forgive oneself? The shadow whispered, genuinely not knowing because forgiveness had never been part of its vocabulary, because it had spent so long cultivating guilt and rage that it had forgotten any other way to exist. Emma stood up from the log and walked closer to the shadow than she had ever dared before, close enough that if it had been solid she could have touched it, close enough that the shadow could feel the warmth of her living energy, could sense the gentle certainty of her presence. "I think," she said slowly, choosing each word with care, "you start by saying it out loud. By telling yourself that you didn't deserve what happened, that you did the best you could, that being human means making mistakes, but also getting chances to try again. And then you start living like someone who's forgiven, even if you don't quite believe it yet. You keep choosing to be good until being good doesn't feel like a choice anymore, until it's just who you are." It was such a simple prescription, such a childlike solution to a problem that had defined more than a century of supernatural existence. But the shadow found itself wanting to believe it could work, found itself willing to try, even if trying meant risking disappointment, found itself ready to speak words it had never allowed itself to consider. "I, Nathaniel Frost, forgive myself," the shadow whispered into the June evening, the words feeling strange and foreign and terrifyingly vulnerable. "I forgive myself for failing to protect my family. I forgive myself for becoming a monster. I forgive myself for the suffering I caused. I choose to be different. I choose to honor Rebecca and Samuel and Margaret by becoming someone who protects rather than destroys. I choose to try to be human again even though I don't know if it's possible." As the words left what passed for its mouth, the shadow felt something shift in its fundamental nature, felt the shape of itself begin to change in ways both subtle and profound. It was not an instant transformation, was not a magical cure or a sudden reversal, but it was a beginning, a loosening of the bonds that had held it in darkness for so long, a possibility opening where before there had been only resignation. The shadow looked down at itself and saw that it was marginally less dark than it had been a moment ago, that there was something almost solid about its edges, that it was starting to have weight and substance in ways it had not had since 1881. Emma saw it too, her eyes widening with wonder and delight, and she said the words the shadow would carry forward into whatever came next. "I knew you could change. I knew you were still a person underneath. Welcome back, Nathaniel." And the shadow, which was slowly becoming something more than a shadow, which was starting to remember what it felt like to have a body and a heartbeat and hands that could touch rather than just frighten, felt something it had not felt in 143 years. It felt hope. Not certainty, not the guarantee that everything would be fine or that transformation would be complete or permanent, but genuine hope that maybe, just maybe, monsters could learn to be men again, that grief could transform into something other than rage, that even the darkest darkness could find its way back toward light. The transformation was not immediate or complete, was more like a gradual shifting of reality than a sudden reversal. Over the following weeks, the shadow found that it could hold a more solid form for longer periods, could manifest not just as concentrated darkness, but as something approaching a human shape, could feel sensations it had not felt in over a century, like the warmth of sunlight on what was becoming skin, the touch of wind on what was becoming a face, the weight of gravity pulling on what was becoming a body. It was disorienting and painful in ways the shadow had not anticipated, because having a body meant experiencing the world in ways that pure consciousness did not, meant feeling hunger and cold and fatigue, meant being limited and vulnerable and finite. But it also meant experiencing joy in ways the shadow had forgotten were possible, meant feeling Emma's hand in what was becoming its hand, meant hearing Jackson's voice with ears that were slowly reforming, meant existing in the world as part of it rather than separate from it. The Whitmore family witnessed the transformation with a mixture of wonder and scientific curiosity and practical concern. Sarah, being a veterinarian, wanted to understand the biological mechanism, even though there was no biological explanation for what was happening. Daniel, being an engineer, tried to find logical patterns in the transformation, even though logic had clearly been suspended. Jackson documented everything with his phone camera and notebooks, was creating what he called the only first-hand account of reverse supernatural transformation in recorded history, was already planning the book he would write about it someday. And Emma simply accepted it with the easy grace of children who have not yet learned that magic is supposed to be impossible, who could watch a shadow become a man and think, of course, that's what should happen when someone chooses to be good. By the time Autumn returned to Montana, marking a full year since Emma had first spoken to the shadow at the forest's edge, Nathaniel Frost was more man than monster. He still was not entirely solid, still had moments when his form would waver and thin, still could slip into shadow when he chose or when his emotions became too intense. But he could hold a human shape for hours at a time, could speak with a voice that had weight and resonance, could sit with the Whitmore family and share meals even though he did not need to eat, could exist in the daylight without being destroyed by it. The authorities had questions, of course, about this stranger who had appeared in the Montana wilderness, claiming to be a man who died in 1881, but Nathaniel had his ways of being convincing, had access to information about the Frost family that no living person should know, had the kind of presence that made people believe impossible things when he looked them in the eye and told them the truth. Emma's 9th birthday gift to Nathaniel was a photograph, one she had found in the Whitefish Historical Society archives during a field trip with her school. It showed the Frost family in front of their cabin in 1880, a year before everything fell apart. Nathaniel looking younger and softer than he remembered being, Rebecca with her hand on his shoulder and a smile that lit up her whole face, Samuel serious and proud with a book tucked under his arm, and Margaret grinning at the camera with the irrepressible joy of a child who had never known true fear. Nathaniel held the photograph with hands that were still learning how to touch things without dissolving them, and he felt tears on his face for the first time in over a century, salt water instead of shadow, grief that could be released instead of endlessly recycled. Emma hugged him while he cried, her small arms barely reaching around his emerging form, and she said, "You can remember them being happy now. You don't have to only remember them being scared." And Nathaniel Frost, who had been a shadow for 143 years, who had fed on fear and inflicted terror, and lost himself so completely that he'd forgotten what it meant to be human, realized that Emma was right. He could remember Rebecca's laugh and Samuel's curiosity and Margaret's fearless kindness. He could honor them by protecting other families, by being the guardian he had failed to be for his own children, by transforming his grief from a curse into a calling. He was not fully human, and might never be, would always carry the darkness of what he had been and what he had experienced, would always exist in the liminal space between monster and man. But that space, he was learning, was where transformation happened, where change became possible, where monsters learned to be protectors and shadows learned to cast light. As winter approached again, Nathaniel Frost built a small cabin near the tree line, where he had spent so long haunting, a simple structure that echoed the one his family had lived in, but was entirely his own. The Whitmores helped, Jackson learning carpentry skills he'd use later in life, Daniel contributing his engineering precision, Sarah ensuring there was space for the stray animals she knew Nathaniel would end up protecting, and Emma choosing the location where her friend's candle had burned on Christmas Eve, where light and darkness had learned to coexist. It was not the life Nathaniel had lost, would never be the life he had lost, but it was a life, was a future, was proof that even the most profound transformation could reverse direction, that monsters could learn to be men, that grief could change shape from weapon to memorial, to finally, after more than a century, into something like peace.